Great. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to MIT Sloan Alumni Online. We're glad you're taking the time out of your day to be with us today. And we are thrilled to be closing out our second season with our featured guest today. Scott Stern is the David Sarnoff Professor of Management of Technology here at MIT Sloan. He also co-founded the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, or MIT REAP, which we'll learn a little bit more about today as we dive into our topic of innovation-driven entrepreneurship. Professor Stern also teaches a popular course called Entrepreneurial Strategy. Some of you may have taken that or have been familiar with this work as well with Aaron Scott. We're really looking forward to learning from Scott and enjoying the conversation that Jackie has prepared for us today. So you will see that we are in a Zoom webinar. Please feel free to add questions to the Q&A panel in your Zoom interface. You can also drop us a note in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. And please feel free to update your Zoom name to include your MIT Sloan program and class year. We love seeing all of our alumni online today. We're glad you're with us. Jackie and Scott, without further ado, I will turn it over to both of you. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Greg. And a big thank you also to the Office of External Relations for your collaboration on this series. We appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you taking the time out of your day to join us. It really is a privilege, as Greg mentioned, to welcome Professor Stern to join our discussion today and to close out this portion of the series. As a student, I had the privilege of learning from Professor Stern, and I can personally say that the frameworks he taught strongly influenced how I thought about entrepreneurship, innovation, and strategy, and they had a profound impact on my professional endeavors. So today, I am very excited for all of you to have the opportunity to hear from Professor Stern and to gain similar insights. So Professor Stern, thank you very much for just taking the time out of your schedule to be with us today. We appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you so very much. And I really want to thank Greg and Zoe and the Office of External Relations, but most notably you, Jackie, for your leadership. I think this is just a great stimulating set of events. I know from others that they've really valued being able to participate in it. I also see a lot of friends and students already on the chat, and so I always want to say hello to all of them, but we'll maybe kind of throw out a few comments to them as we go forward. So first, thank you, and really thank you for hosting it.
Absolutely, thank you. So before we move into the questions we have prepared today, I think is a great place to start. Could you share a little bit more about just your background as well as your experiences with REAP, which will largely kind of inform our conversation today?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you all. Thank you, Jackie, and really just a great team. You as MIT alumni know that we are committed, when you were here as students or as current students, as faculty members, to really idea to impact mens humanis. And I had done a bunch of research early in my career that was about understanding, in some sense, when you think about MIT and the area just around us in Kendall Square, you can see it, this kind of role that innovation ecosystems, that innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems play in shaping the ability of startups to succeed, to advance both the company, and then ultimately drive economic performance and social progress. And interestingly, though, then that really raises a question of, okay, we get, I had gone to Stanford, Silicon Valley, we get the area around MIT, but can that be sort of scaled in a systematic way? And I had been doing some work with both regions, with different types of stakeholders, sometimes a corporate, sometimes very much entrepreneurs, sometimes very much government, sometimes universities. And what I found was that that my particular kind of interventions were really hard to make impactful. And so a group of faculty members, myself, Fiona Murray, Bill Ollett, came together, this is more than a decade ago now, and said, can we kind of move beyond the boulevard of broken dreams, kind of high aspirations, but low impact, to really do something more systematic about how we drive change and transformation in innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems. I should say as well, Jean-Jacques de Groot is on the call, and he just put it in the chat. His book is a fantastic, I think, synthesis of the organic kind of bottoms up approach that really kind of animate MIT, and it's something that we use strongly in the REAP program. But so then we established REAP, and it was a real experiment. And when I say it was an experiment, I think that the dean's office thought we were going to do it once. It wasn't going to go so well, and then everyone would forget about it. But interestingly, we had a unique opportunity to really work with leverage stakeholder teams from around the world, making sure each team included entrepreneurs, risk capital, government, university, corporates. And interestingly, those groups within any given region don't necessarily see on the same page. They don't have the same shared assumptions about the as-is state or where they want to go. But by bringing those stakeholders together, by really pushing them a little bit in a kind of MIT style from the fire hose to develop a shared assessment, and then use that shared assessment and that stakeholder trust, that can allow them to target effective and meaningful interventions, strategic interventions that can really drive and accelerate their innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem. Two insights from that, maybe just to set up the rest of this discussion. The first, and I think Jean-Jacques will agree on this, no one is in charge of entrepreneurship and innovation. No one's in charge. So in other words, many of you are calling in, you're at a corporate or you're in a university setting or you're even playing a policy role, you're an entrepreneur. Each of those actors plays a role. And of course, the entrepreneurs and innovators have to do the work of getting their ideas to impact, building their companies from founding to scale. But they're not responsible individually for the ecosystem. But then even a very strong institution like MIT can't just dictate what's going to happen, because they have to essentially encourage and put on the table with other stakeholders an environment that allows those innovators and entrepreneurs to succeed, to grow, to thrive, to collaborate. So first, no one's in charge. And then the second piece, maybe just kind of keep in our heads as we continue this, because I think some of the questions will be like, how do we port this to more general, right? Is that the future of innovation and entrepreneurship is going to be very much focused on thinking, entrepreneurship is about pursuing opportunity in advance of, without regard to your current resources and capabilities. In other words, how do you draw upon your ecosystem? How do you take advantage of the place you're in, of the connections and networks you have? And how can you use that to drive your company, to drive your innovation, and ultimately to drive the places that we live and the places that we live? So I know that was a lot. I'm happy to dive into a bunch of examples that we had and kind of stories and so on and so forth, but I thought that might be a good way to set it up.
No, that was perfect. And thank you for the context and the background. So I think actually a perfect place to start, and you alluded to it a few moments ago, but that stakeholder engagement is a unique component of REAP and an important component as well. So could you speak a little bit more about the role that they play and how you best go about leveraging them?
Right. I mean, I know that we have a bunch of EMBAs and Sloan Fellows on here, as well as other MIT programs, but I think, think about it, this way. In many of activities in our lives, our organizations that we lead, that we work within, they're in charge of something, right? To first approximation, what happens in our classroom, I have to kind of go back and forth maybe with the administration and whatever, the dean's office on, the classes we're teaching, but to first approximation, right? We have a shared experience in our classroom that's being driven by our faculty and our students. Not so much in entrepreneurship. Every single actor matters. And unless you get engagement from each actor, each leveraged stakeholder, the ability to leverage that ecosystem is unlikely to happen. So let me give you a very specific example. In one of our early cohorts, we took the whole cohort in a big event. We went to Singapore. We actually had a formal dinner at, I think it's called Itsani, the kind of, the White House of Singapore. It was a big high-level event for the Singaporean government, and their REAP team in Singapore did extraordinary things, building out ultimately what became SG Innovate. With that said, we had an opportunity to visit some accelerators in Singapore, entrepreneurial accelerators. And we went to the government-funded accelerator. And that accelerator had the best coffee machine, it had the best ping pong tables, it had a good maker space. It was only missing one thing, Jackie: entrepreneurs. Literally, when we walked in, there was one person at the front, and there was no one else there. It was the middle of the day. And they were a little embarrassed by it, but we sort of said, they said, oh, then we went less than a mile away to another accelerator that had actually been funded by a VC. And it actually had not such great facilities. It was in a little bit less of a shiny district, but it was on fire. It was fantastic. Bill jumped in, everything, Bill jumped into it. He's talking with the founders. We're having a great time. But wisely, the Singaporean team took a lesson from that, which is rather than build and spend tens of millions of dollars on accelerators that no one uses, they had to work directly with the VCs to figure out what kind of environment, if we're going to spend some money around this, if we're going to prioritize it, how can we work with risk capital? How can we work directly with entrepreneurs to actually make this work? Now you might say, oh, that's totally obvious. But Singapore has a very structured legal system about, for example, doesn't want to do too much external contracting and just giving a bunch of money to VCs so they can build spaces for their companies. Well, might say, well, we can't do that. We're the government. We can't choose winners. And you shouldn't. But the key was they had to come up with a framework and do a little bit of extra work so that those two different stakeholder groups, and in this case as well, it turned out the universities, could kind of come together collaboratively, creating something that otherwise would not have existed. And so when I talk about the power of stakeholders, what I mean is that that even if you are trying your best, you're putting strategic priority, unless you get engagement from other key stakeholders in these systems, it's very unlikely that you're going to realize the value you're hoping to create and capture. Great.
Absolutely. Well, and kind of along those same lines, and you talked about this, but the ability to collaborate and to have a shared and common goal. And so certainly that goes hand in hand with kind of shared assessment, which is another central theme of REAP. So could you talk a little bit more about how success is evaluated or measured in this program and how this can translate into other areas?
Yep, absolutely. And let me take two versions of that, particularly because I know many of you are coming from a kind of corporate, we'd like to engage our broader innovation ecosystems. We would like ourselves to have a playbook, but also you're going to need those metrics for accountability. Phil Button and Fiona Murray have a very nice article in Sloan Management Review from just a few months ago on sort of corporate engagement in ecosystems that I highly recommend. And if either Greg or Zoe could put that in the chat at some point, it'd be great. But let me just mention one or two around shared assessment and metrics. So the first is that the underlying logic of REAP is that, of course, we somehow understand within our ecosystem, as a state, our latent strengths and bottlenecks. What are the things that we're proud of that we could build on? And what are the things that we should have been fixed 5 years ago that just hasn't gotten done? That itself, if you can then bring stakeholders together to gain shared understanding of that can motivate very leveraged strategic interventions that hopefully can kind of unleash the power of the ecosystem. Now, interestingly, that comes with a big caveat around measurement, which means that since every region is going to have their own unique strategy, their own unique challenges, the metrics that you need to put in place to maintain accountability, to maintain to be able to do real-time course correction is going to depend on the strategy itself. And so let me just give you two very specific examples. So for example, in our team from Iceland, one of the kind of key interventions they did that made its way all the way, through the Icelandic parliament was that they wanted to reorient their technology licensing process. They have 3 very strong universities. They have actually strong entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneurs and the university researchers weren't talking to each other. And so by creating a kind of one-stop, kind of seamless ability to kind of draw from research at the university, then Iceland itself could enhance its enterprise. So far, so good? Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means the metrics that you would use are going to be specific to, for example, how many more licenses do we see? How many more collaborations of co-authorships or patents or new ventures do we see that are coming out of this newly designed TLO? That's actually very different from, say, an initiative whose main goal is to accelerate the number of innovation-driven enterprises in the region, where we might look not at the number of licenses from the university, but we look at the number of IDEs and really kind of come up with a scheme, an approach for measuring them, seeing which programs they're engaging with and not, and seeing what factors determine their acceleration or not. The last part I put, and I know we don't have quite enough time for this, is along with just a fantastic doctoral student, Jorge Guzman, who's now at Columbia University, we also came up with not just strategy-specific metrics, but then really trying to capture ecosystem metrics, things that emerge beyond the strategy that are about what's happening at the system level. And so one of the things we've done is try to look at, for any given region, how do we give real-time, very granular data that allows policymakers, that allows corporates, that allow university, allows entrepreneurs and innovators to gauge their ecosystem, to understand both not just the quantity of entrepreneurship, but also its quality, and then use that to drive progress. I think actually on this call is another fantastic former student of ours, Danny Kim, who's been incredible work that I think that both builds on and complements and also is very novel in its own way. He's at the Wharton School and working with the US Census. And Danny, I just should say, in fact, just won Best 40 Under 40 from Poets and Quants. So we should all give him a congratulations. Sorry, Jackie, back to you. So big picture, strategy-specific metrics for course correction, ecosystem-specific metrics to really drive what's happening in the system.
Well, no, absolutely. That is certainly worth celebrating. So I'm glad you
I just wanted to get that in there. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm glad you did. Well, no, and so kind of building upon the last 2 comments with the focus on stakeholder engagement and then also thinking about shared assessment, going hand in hand with that is also being strategic about your intervention. And that is also another focus of the program within REAP. So could you talk a little bit more about why this is important and the impact that it has for entrepreneurs?
Absolutely. So let me start with, there are most people on this call will be familiar with getting together in some stakeholder group for a bunch of meetings. And you're kind of all polite to each other, and usually you're representing an organization, so they don't commit to too much. You kind of have a nice reception in the evening, and you're like, that was a fine use of my time. I'm not sure I repeat it, but good for them. And you use the word them, meaning it's other people's thing. And there are lots of reports. There are lots of analytics about ecosystems, about challenges for innovation and entrepreneurship within any given location. And there are very good projects around. Our insight from REAP was that all of that doesn't make a difference unless it turns into shared assessment and action. What you need to do is identify a sequence of activities, a strategy, specific initiatives that can either leverage some latent strength that you just haven't pushed on hard enough, maybe some piece of your comparative advantage, maybe some infrastructure, maybe a way that people network within your region, or address some bottleneck, some key challenge that's stopping the entrepreneurs and the innovators from being able to go from idea to impact. And once you get crystallization around that, then the stakeholders stop showing up to the meetings because it's a nice thing to do or because they're doing a favor, but because they see it as directly advancing the mission and impact of the organizations that they serve and the organizations they want to build. And so, for example, we were very fortunate to work with a fantastic team from Nova Scotia in Canada. And in Nova Scotia, that's not like the most high-tech place in Canada. It's a little bit off the beaten path. It's very beautiful if you want to go touristically, okay? And Halifax is a great city, and there are a bunch of small regional towns. But it is not the hotbed of, or was not the hotbed for innovation and entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
Very politely, because they're Canadian, but the team really started to get to work. And then what they did is they took it a layer deeper. And they're like, why don't we actually build, and with some Canadian federal support, build out an ocean supercluster in Atlantic Canada. And that actually was bigger than the province of Nova Scotia. So they took advantage of this opportunity from the federal government that probably they otherwise wouldn't have been able to kind of organize themselves around. The fact is that while Nova Scotia isn't a leader in everything in tech in Canada, in fact, not at all, its comparative advantage was in deep ocean technology and maybe infusing AI, machine learning, other approaches, right, to fuse that to a bunch of new innovative products and services. And so there are kind of good kind of complementarities then between different programs. So they did, for example, a very nice program that's actually at the University of Toronto called the Creative Destruction Lab. That was a really focused accelerator. The Ocean Supercluster kind of works with those firms and helps them scale and commercialize within Nova Scotia. And then they realized, though, that wasn't quite enough. What were we doing for the region beyond the very kind of deep tech associated with the ocean, for the fishing villages, for logistics companies, so on and so forth? And they built out a backbone organization called Onsite, which has turned into a real driver for and we actually did a kind of refocus program with them, but a real driver of regional change within Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada. So and each of those, just go back to your earlier question, comes with its own metrics, its own team, but we produced enough trust that they're not competing efforts. Those efforts are each of them spilling over one into the other, each better because the other interventions are within the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a bunch there. Okay. So.
Absolutely. And so since, as you mentioned earlier, since there are some people that are on the call who have more of maybe a corporate lens, could you talk about how this, the concept of strategic intervention could apply more broadly to business and to corporations, more established corporations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say, a bunch of different things around this and some lessons that we've learned. The fact is that while the bulk of our R&D still takes place in very large firms, the bulk of our impactful innovation and entrepreneurship is actually coming out of universities, coming out of startups, coming out external to those corporations. And Fiona and myself, along with a doctoral student here, Alexis Howie, and Jillian Cole of the patent office, kind of recently actually did a little paper that kind of crystallized that notion and showed some evidence around it. And so one of the things that so the question is, how is a corporate, you just say, oh, we just give up creative destruction, we're going to be yesterday's news, right? Or should you lean in? And so very often what you see corporates do is they'll say, oh, we need X. We need a new technology, or we need to get our handle on AI. So we're going to go and find some startup and we're going to acquire the startup on a one-off basis. And luckily, sometimes that is very successful. However, our experience is that the most successful corporates are those that actually have a strategy for engaging their innovation ecosystem more generally. that have a strategy of kind of almost thinking about different modalities they can put in place, some of which they, for example, M&A, that's largely under the control of the company. You know what I'm saying? There's a great article in today's Fortune that just came out in Fortune, actually about the acquisition of PillPack, which many of you know, and the battle between Walmart and Amazon to acquire them in 2018. Really eye-opening, right? But there are other activities that corporates can do before that kind of almost set you up for a better outcome from that M&A. University partnership on an extended basis. Things like, for example, at MIT, the Industrial Liaison Program Startup Exchange. So that's an opportunity for ILP corporate members to not just get access to MIT research in the traditional way and do sponsored research, but actually to meet with, help solve problems, provide mentoring to startups. And I remember when they proposed it about 10 years ago, they proposed the Startup Exchange, and most of you know that I love startups and I love entrepreneurship. And I was worried that all these big companies were just going to gobble up the startups and too much administration, and it was going to be not good. And I was upfront about my view. And I love being wrong, and I was wrong about that. The Startup Exchange has turned into an incredibly powerful mechanism. I was just at their conference 2 weeks ago, where you really see some of the world's leading corporates not, kind of almost taking a kind of, recognizing they're not in charge and contributing directly to the ecosystem and putting in the work so that a few years from now, when they all of a sudden the next tech thing comes up, all of a sudden they're well positioned to understand it, absorb and bring it into their organization, and do those acquisitions, do the M&A that actually can drive their impact. So the first, kind of cluster that I'd say is those, corporates can use this approach in very concrete ways. And what I'd say is that there's a kind of range of things. Some are much more informal, it's almost like how much you let your people, your workers, your BD people kind of just collaborate and work with people in the ecosystem. And some are much more structured exchanges, either, for example, formal research projects with universities or national labs, or, very structured, relationships over technology alliances. And if you have a portfolio, the strategy is kind of being able to kind of see that portfolio and then kind of using that portfolio approach to kind of drive so that you're kind of ready for whatever is over the horizon. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges in the model. So could you speak to when stakeholder engagements work and the conditions that are needed to have success there, and when they don't, what does failure look like?
Yep, absolutely. And while we have a pretty good track record in REIT, we also, some regions have not made it, a very small number, haven't even made it through the program, or I would say their outcomes have been not what we or they had hoped for. Mm-hmm. And we really look at those and building on work that sort of says, what are the conditions for stakeholder-led success and ecosystem intervention? And so I would highlight 2 or 3 big pieces. The first of those is, if we cannot agree on the as-is state, if we don't have it's exceedingly unlikely that we will come to an understanding of what to do if we don't agree on the as-is state. And you might say, oh, that's very easy. We'll hire a consultant, we'll do a report. Jacqueline's like, yes, that's what happened. Right? It's very convenient to do that. And many people, that's what people do. And the problem is that if the report doesn't quite jive with what people feel on the ground, and Jean-Jacques and I have had conversations around this, they're not going to believe in the strategy. And they, as a stakeholder, aren't going to show up. Do you see what I'm saying? And so very often, if you say, oh, it turns out our problem is risk capital, And when you talk to the entrepreneurs, they're like, actually, our problem is actually more. We need more people who actually, we need more people who join our firms if we could ever raise money. We just are starved for people. Well, no, they're not going to believe the report, and then they're not going to engage. So that's part A. Part B is that, and I hinted at it before, is that people very often confuse, we got the stakeholders together for a meeting with our stakeholders are engaged in a meaningful way. Everyone will show up for a meeting to be nice, to see what's going on, to be polite, to be constructive. But you're not going to show up for the second meeting unless you see that it directly advances, or some way you can see that it advances the broad, and I don't mean narrow monetary, but sort of the broad objectives of your organization, your career, your hopes for your ecosystem. And we see that in REAP, but it's a real process. One of the metrics that I love is when I get an email from a REAP team member and their REAP affiliation is directly on their email. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're starting to see that stakeholder engagement as part of their personal identity. When we see it on their LinkedIn profiles, right? You say, I did this and I'm very proud of that. So this question is, can you get there? And the key to doing that, so the question is, what leads to that? Well, one is putting the conditions in place where it's not just for the region's good or for the champion, the REAP champion's narrow goal. It's got to serve, the strategy has to serve the broad interest of all the stakeholders. And so then what you thirdly need to do is you're then about to you're standing at the cliff, you're about to jump off. Because the success of your initiative that you're betting part of your organizational capital depends on whether or not these other people come along with you. And that requires trust. And for those that remember Bob Gibbons' class, relational contracts, if you think about the work we do, right, in your OP classes, right, around trust, all that turns out to be so important. How do we put in place the conditions that produce trust among the stakeholders so that they can think beyond their own organization, but also be upfront about what their organization is going to need so they can engage in the collective activity that's going to advance those organizations, those stakeholders, as well as have that broader impact. I will say, and I think a few members of or actually a member or two of the team are on here, is we really saw this very powerfully with the team that was actually during COVID, was from Abuja, Nigeria. Very government, there was very heavy on government, but also had some really cool entrepreneurs, some very interesting people from the university, some great MIT alums. And that team took their job very serious. And we had a great earlier team from Lagos that was we're building on some of that, some energy. And ultimately, they realized the problem in Nigeria, which is obviously at a very different stage of economic development. They didn't have a legal framework in the country to enable IDEs, to enable innovation-driven entrepreneurs. Yes, there were a few unicorns, but that was despite the system, not because of it. And then these stakeholders came together and they looked each other in the eye, and I'll say it was very powerful. And they agreed to go together to really champion what became, very directly, the Nigeria Startup Bill, which became an act of the Nigerian legislative system signed by the president and really shaping a new legal framework that instantiates Nigeria as a place that you can do business as an innovation-driven entrepreneur. And that's actually, there's a lot of energy right now in sub-Saharan Africa that everybody now wants their Ghanaian startup bill, Egyptian startup bill, so on and so forth, and really building off what is seen, despite other challenges in Nigeria, as I think a kind of broad legislative success that depended on connecting that trust to impact. And to be honest, that's hard to do. that requires some tough conversations and requires some risk.
Mhm.
Great.
Well, no, that's incredible, certainly, and you're 100% right that building a foundation of trust is certainly key to any new initiative and building collaboration and bringing people along with you to achieve your outcomes.
Yeah.
So I guess, again, going back to the fact that, we do have people from more of a corporate perspective on the line as well. Maybe could you share your thoughts on how some of these same frameworks and concepts could best be applied in a more corporate environment?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that right a little bit before. But let me do one or two pieces if that's okay, Jackie. I saw one piece if Greg and Zoe can put in on metrics. I know there are a bunch of things on kind of there's a great great. We have a lot of work on how to measure entrepreneurial ecosystems at the Startup Cartography Project. And if either Zoe or Greg can put that into the chat, and I promise you'll see maps and visualizations and a whole analytics approach that is a separate set of 10 to 12 papers that we've written with Jorge and Kathy Fazio and some other people. Very, very good. Thank you, Greg. Okay, great. Sorry, going back. Jackie. So one thing, and so let me just kind of round out on the corporates piece, is I do feel, and it kind of gets to to some of the questions about lack of execution, is very often the open innovation part of a big corporate is separate from strategy. It never makes its way to the C-suite. It's a nice activity. It's almost like CSR. You know what I'm saying? Right? Which is crazy. An open approach, an ecosystem approach to engaging startups, engaging universities, engaging your national laboratory system, engaging innovators of all types, engaging almost like Eric von Hippel, our customers, others in our value chains, to kind of foment innovation. Each of those, right, is an opportunity to supercharge what drives and creates value for your firm, right? Really drives a competitive advantage of the company. And so the question is, so I'm going to kind of turn the question around, Jackie, is my sense is that there are very good examples of companies that have their open innovation system very separate from their strategy and from their core products and services, and things kind of move along. You see what I'm saying? And sometimes the magic occurs and there's nice things. But here, I think we're emphasizing that you're having a little bit more of engagement, having a little bit more of proactively creating linkages and empowering those people who are themselves engaging with the ecosystem. So just to go back to that example of the ILP Startup Exchange Conference, I'm going to misremember her name, or I can't remember her name right this very second, but she was kind of senior in the open innovation at Takeda. And that was a group that had been established almost basically 8 or 9 years ago. And what's interesting about her journey was she was like, we got started, we have this open innovation thing. It had a lot of energy at the beginning because all the people who loved startups engaged with it, but it didn't correspond to anything in the company. And she's like, what we learned is that we need to have a more systematic approach to actually have some people who are almost like understand the internal of the corporate as well as the external. And it's like our unfortunately passed away faculty, wonderful and valued faculty member, Tom Allen, that some of you might remember. Tom did this beautiful work all the way back in the 1960s, showing the role of the gatekeepers within innovation organizations. And in some sense, we are inspired by that work, and we're trying to give a language and an approach that corporates can use to instantiate that to meaningfully drive innovation in their movements.
No, very good points. Thank you very much for sharing. So I think in our final question, for our final question in terms of the moderated ones we have prepared, we wanted to kind of take a step out and have more of a broader view. So certainly a big part of REAP is not just focusing on the individual companies themselves, but on regional economic and social progress. And so if we turn to that focus to the US, certainly recently with the IRA bill and the CHIPS and Science Act, could you talk a little bit about, in your experiences, in your opinion, how those might have an impact on the social and economic landscape in the US?
Yeah, and so thank you for it. So as some of you might know, not everybody's, you kind of have to be in the weeds, so there were a group of us who had been doing research for 25 years saying place-based innovation ecosystems was a way to drive regional US policy, that you had to solve it. You couldn't pretend that there were no challenges. And hopefully this conversation has been honest on coming up with a more systematic model, overcoming what our colleague at the Harvard Business School, Josh Lerner, calls the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And within the CHIPS and Science Act, as well as some other legislation and the IRA, there are a wide variety of different place-based initiatives that are just absolutely reshaping federal policy. We've been very fortunate. The National Science Foundation reached out to myself and a group of other colleagues, Heidi Williams, who used to be in our economics department here, Jorge, Fiona Murray, and as well as a group of others. And we actually had a quite structured discussion with them about how to make programs like the new NSF Engines program actually work. And I can make available, it'll be coming out in just a few weeks, a kind of white paper. We have it in draft form if you send me an email, but it'll be posted. You'll see it'll be posted in various places in just a few weeks. But what are the kind of key insights we got from that? Sorry to ramble for a minute. Is that, so there are new programs, say the NSF Engines program, that basically are taking what we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes and scaling it across the US. And right now, right, and I know this is a really diverse audience, both internationally, so many of your governments are doing this abroad, certainly in Europe, but even all around the world. And in the US, your communities are almost surely engaging in this, and you can get involved. But these efforts are aimed at really using this kind of approach to really figure out how do we take the kind of, not quite forgotten, but let's call them overlooked, potential innovation districts in the United States and supercharge them. How do we take a place like Rochester, New York, or around Purdue, or Atlanta? And once again, there's great things already going on in all those places. But Chapel Hill and Research Triangle Park. How do we take them to that next level to really drive inclusive economic change? And what's the risk of it all? Is that we spend a ton of money and just push on a string. Is that we end up building the Singapore accelerators, the ones that no one should have. And so to give great credit to I've engaged with a bunch of people across the federal government, but in particular, we've really had an opportunity to engage quite deeply with the National Science Foundation on this. They are putting up a very systematic effort to try to really ensure that they're putting in place the conditions for success. Meaningfully building out those stakeholder teams, identifying the unique thing, not just be the next Silicon Valley. What is unique about Minneapolis? What is unique about Kansas City? And then driving it to not just talk about it, but to actually break through, go through the roadblocks, and actually implement change. So kind of broadly, and then I know we'll have some other questions, is I think this is a historic opportunity where we see the federal government in the United States, as well as governments around the world, basically have taken the kind of scattered evidence on this, the kind of mini experiments we've been doing within REAP, within some of the work we did with the EDA a decade ago, the Economic Development Administration, and trying to bring that to scale. And as MIT alumni, you have an opportunity to engage within your regions, to make these efforts successful. Rather than say, oh, should we move out to California, or should we move back to Boston, or whatever, Cambridge, or whatever it would be, an opportunity to say, listen, this is a chance for our region to prosper, to grow, to advance our own organization, to advance our own mission, and to have the kind of impact and live in the places that we want.
Mhm.
So there you go.
I think that's really fantastic. Wonderful to see the success and that's moving forward, but also just a perfect way to close out the moderated portion of the session. So thank you very much.
Great.
So now we'll move into some of the submitted and open questions that we've received. So we did receive a number of questions that were submitted prior to the event. So we'll start with those, but feel free to add more into the chat and we'll get to as many of them as possible before the top of the hour. So I guess the first place to start, and you did touch on this earlier, Professor Stern, but maybe you could speak about it a little bit more specifically. Do you think that building a specific area to be in charge of innovation within a company is the best way to innovate, or is a distributed model preferred?
So for those of you who have ever taken a strategy course from me, you know I'm going to be all about identify the multiple options, make sure both of them are good, a bunch of them are good, and then you obviously have to choose one. I think that increasingly we see the traditional model of literally the R&D silo. I don't think this is new, but sort of kind of handing off to other parts of the organization. I think that model mostly has gone away, even in organizations that still maintain a very strong research culture. For example, Microsoft Research is very integrated, at the end of the day, with many other activities around its organization.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is, I'd say, some degree of distribution, of cross-function, of connecting products and innovation function is happening. With that said, I think that there's a case to be made for not putting the kind of cart before the horse here. I think many people will label their, they'll say, oh, we're going to do cross-function. And what they mean by that is we're going to do very near-term business development, customer feedback, just whatever the customer wanted yesterday, that's what R&D is working on today. Did you see what I'm saying? There's actually a pretty fascinating clip that's kind of going around Twitter or whatever right now by Sam Altman, who used to be the head of Y Combinator and is now, as most of you know, the head of OpenAI. And when he was at Y Combinator, it was all the lean startup. What does customer want? Primary market research, just try A/B testing. And then, of course, OpenAI got founded. It was 5 years before they produced anything. And they were, whether or not you agree with OpenAI or not, they clearly have been able, relative to many other larger players, able to get ahead in large language models. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? And he said something interesting. I think he realized is in the forum that he made the point that he used to have this one piece of advice that he would give. Go talk to the customer. And that's still good advice. But that it turns out having a clear innovation strategy and giving your team the space they need to explore, to have failure, to really learn is also important. So how does that read onto the question? Is choosing your organization is choosing which problems to manage. If you're going to choose to have a very deep tech, a little bit more removed from the customer approach, you better put in place mechanisms to make sure that people don't just, old Bell Lab style invent things and don't do anything with them. Xerox PARC, right? Similarly, if you're going to lean into the customer experience, you're going to lean into integration with other functions of the company, you better put in place some sort of infrastructure, maybe the ability to do research collaborations with university professors or whatever it might be, that let you attract and retain and do exploration even while you're having that more kind of direct focus on the customer. So there you go.
Oh, that's wonderful advice. Thank you. Okay, and so the next question we received is, how can entrepreneurial strategy frameworks find verticals or themes or niches that do not require any external capital?
That is a great question. And if you ask me what was I doing later today, one of the projects that we are currently working on is a paper on capital and entrepreneurial strategy. So TBD, so hold your horses. So first, this is just for, I know many people here, I see great names in the chat and on the Zoom, is finally, Erin, myself, and Josh Gans, our book is coming out by the end of the year. Entrepreneurship, a strategic approach. And if you like the material when you had it in our classrooms, it'll be in a big shiny book. And so I recommend it. It's a textbook, and but I think it'll be fun for everyone to have. And we do have an entire chapter in that on financing and talk a little bit about this. Thank you, Mikhail. Exactly. Right? Second. So different strategies involve different levels of capital. And so for a given idea, what are the strategies in which you can kind of end up attracting less capital or retain a higher equity stake? Those are going to be ones where you are able to lead more quickly into the customer. So we should be clear about that. If you can focus on the core of the strategy is execution rather than control over the idea, the strategy itself, if successful, will require less external capital. And the reason is because you're going to be getting money from customers, and so you're able to bootstrap. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that's a crowdsourcing, whether or not that's a pre-product launch, whatever it might be. I know this is not popular with everyone. I'm a big fan of things like, external, easy to get, kind of non-dilutive capital, SBIR or other types. I think that very often we poo those types of programs. We have lots of good evidence that they work and they help companies. But more importantly, within the kind of strategy frame, I'd say is that if you are able to look at two alternative strategies, one of which maybe will take a longer time to get to market, but you're kind of on a more solid foundation once you get there, almost like an open table, right? It took them forever to really raise, get revenue. You're going to need a lot of external capital because you're going to need to support the organization through a long period. Second is if you are more execution, if you can figure out how to get that MVP out, you're going to be much more powerfully. And I think a lot of the work that Bill and his team do at the Trust Center, on entrepreneurship, right? That kind of emphasizes that that the necessary and sufficient condition is the customer. And that is going to rely less on external. And the only one additional piece I would throw in there is just to also talk about the type of capital. So there's a big difference between, for example, if you're pursuing a more cooperative approach and the capital itself is coming from your strategic partner, now that's committing you to the strategy, but there's much more alignment there between the partner and you than potentially in a more hands-off external capital. So just to kind of briefly wrap up, capital and strategy, or capital should serve strategy, and strategy has to be sensitive to the availability and the nature of capital around. If you're closer you can get to the customer more quickly, the more you're going to be able to, avoid dilution. On the other hand, if you are able to attract significant external capital up front, that might allow you to take some steps up front that allow you to kind of secure a better foundation for longer term advantage.
That's perfect. Very good. Very good.
Lot in
advice.
there. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's perfect. I think we might have time for two more questions. So the next was a submitted question. We also received a question in the chat that's somewhat similar. But could you just speak about how someone who is interested might be able to bring REAP to their region?
Absolutely. And maybe here I'll rely mostly on Greg and Zoe just to throw, the REAP, kind of link in the chat. The most important, I should have said this when you asked half an hour ago. We have learned that the most important condition for making a REAP regional initiative a success is the ability to bring a team. Just to get a group assembled who are willing to dig in. It doesn't matter where your as-is state is, what your challenges are. If you can get a group of committed people who represent those leveraged stakeholders, entrepreneurs, risk capital, government, university, corporates, then the REAP process is set up for success. And so the first step, once again, our REAP team, I think a few of them might be here, but they're fantastic at kind of helping you access materials and kind of get a sense, webinars, so on and so forth. But the second piece of that is as you're talking to people within your regional ecosystems, as a corporate, when you're thinking about how you're going to interact with your innovation ecosystem, maybe put together a meeting of what might be a potential REAP team. Maybe just to kind of start very simple, kind of longish lunch. What do we see are the challenges of the region and how can we improve them? Some of you might know our wonderful colleague, Kat Turco, who just wrote a wonderful book about Harvard Square. And I know that, we usually don't talk about Harvard here, but so it goes. And she wrote about the history of Harvard Square. And in particular, as the role of Harvard Square as a market. And particularly things, she kind of has a whole chapter about the Harvard sort of Square business associations and the motives and the nature of people participating. Why do I bring that up, even in our last few minutes? Is just the act of bringing together people in a very informal way to say, what do you hope for? What's your organization working? You as an entrepreneur, what do you see as your big bottlenecks? That can stimulate the kind of trust building, the kind of relations that can then become the nucleus of a great REAP team. So that's our experience.
Well, I think that's perfect. And we're actually just at the top of the hour. So I think it's a wonderful way to close, talk about how to get involved. And REAP is certainly a wonderful program and you've done a tremendous amount with it. So congratulations on all of the success. And thank you again, Professor, for just taking the afternoon to share your thoughts with us. We appreciate it.
Jackie, thank you for your leadership all around this. Thank you to Greg and Zoe and External Relations for hosting. And thank you all for the very lively chat. I'm sure that I see Stephanie out there. So hello, Stephanie. I saw Michaela, so on and so forth. It's just wonderful seeing you all. I know I won't get to say hello to all of you, but it was really just a delight to see both old and new faces on my Zoom this afternoon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Jackie. And our great thanks to our viewers for joining us today. This program is made possible by you, our alumni, students, and friends, with your generous support of the MIT Sloan Annual Fund. So we are getting ready to wrap, but when you close out of the Zoom today, you will see a survey appear on your screen. Please fill that out and let us know your feedback on today's session. We also dropped links in the chat to REAP, to a lot of the research that has been done by Scott and his colleagues. We also have the MIT REAP Impact Summit, which will be here in Cambridge on August 30th through September 1st. We'll also include that information in our follow-up emails. And lastly, our program is going on hiatus for the summer. So huge thank you to Jackie for wrapping up our second season. You can look for more information about our next kickoff, which will be this fall in September. So we'll be sharing info on that with all of you shortly. And with that, I think we will go ahead and adjourn. So please take what you learned here today with you. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.
Hey guys, thank you all.
Take care.